Ladies and gentlemen, this is an historic moment. I think it's the first time in history that a City Bar event has ever started on time, to be quite honest with you. We're even a couple of minutes early, so I'm a bit shell-shocked. My name is Michael Cooper, and it's my great pleasure and responsibility and pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, or what we call more colloquially, simply City Bar. I chair the Council on International Affairs here at City Bar, and I'd like to take just one moment to tell you a bit about City Bar. We're an organization of about 24,000 lawyers, mostly from the metropolitan area, but quite frankly from all parts of the globe, who work together to advance the rule of law and access to justice. And we do so through about 160 committees that focus on everything from bankruptcy to international law and sort of everything in between. I could tell you much more about City Bar, but I think what I'd like to do is tell you why we decided to co-host this event this evening with HBS. So I chair the Council on International Affairs, and for City Bar, this is a real moment of both reflection and inflection, I can say. Next year, City Bar will celebrate its 150th anniversary, and so of course we're reflecting back on our accomplishments during that last 150 years. We're also taking stock of this moment that we live in, this very challenging moment when the international legal order that it's very fair to say the members of this association have helped to construct over the decades is under attack from all points on the globe. So we're asking ourselves two very important questions. The first one is, as we're watching this attack unfold, what is our responsibilities of members of this association to defend that international legal order? That's a pretty simple question. We know that we need to step up to the plate. I think the more difficult question for us has been, to the extent that that international legal order proves to be indefensible in part, what's our responsibility to engage and to sort of reimagine that order when and where we can? That's why we were so interested in this event tonight and so interested to hear what Catherine Gehl and Michael Porter have to say. I won't take up any more of your time. I think we're going to jump now to a short video, and then after that, Mr. Peter Cyrus, thank you, forgive me, will introduce our speakers. So with that, I will turn the floor over to our video screens. Welcome once again, and thank you.
Well, you may be surprised because I don't look like a video screen. We're having technical difficulties, so we're going to skip the video for the moment. But as soon as the video's ready, we'll rethink the strategy. My name is Peter Cyrus, and I'm a member of the Harvard alumni group, Reform Elections Now. And we would like to thank the Bar Association, the Harvard Business School Club, everybody associated with One Harvard, and of course, Catherine and Michael for coming tonight. So thank you all very much. And we obviously want to thank you for coming. 2 years ago, I was participating in a Harvard Business School discussion group, and we were discussing ways of improving the U.S. economy. And as we read the U.S. competitiveness report by Michael Porter and Jan Rivkin and a couple of others, we kept arriving at the same answer. The U.S. was dropping behind other countries in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other important areas because our political system was dysfunctional. Instead of legislating, politicians were playing to their bases and refusing to govern in a bipartisan manner. We then read the report by Catherine and Michael detailing how the political industry was failing America. And this report was one of those aha moments that come around very rarely. We thought we understood what was wrong with the political system. It was Donald Trump or the Squad or some other candidate on the right or the left. But Catherine and Michael figured out something everyone else had missed. I won't spoil the surprise by telling you what they figured out. I'm going to let them do that. I will merely comment that as we began to study what they had written, we became increasingly convinced that they had come up with an analysis that was both original and powerful. But Catherine and Michael did more than analyze the problem. They came up with real solutions that could create more moderation, less polarization, and more competitive elections. Our group, Reform Elections Now, has spent 2 years, and incidentally, you have a flyer on your seat from Reform Elections Now. We'd love for you to join our group. But we've spent 2 years studying Catherine's and Michael's analysis and recommendation. In this time, we've become increasingly convinced that they have come up with alternatives that can and will work. We've also worked with other reform groups and monitored their activities. This has left us increasingly optimistic that we can solve the problems of the political system. Now, changing our political system is not an easy task. The two parties have had 170 years to figure out how to rig it. The issues are complicated and require people who are willing to educate themselves and others. However, we believe that if people like you understand the problems, we can join together to reform our system in order to make government work. We are really delighted to have Catherine and Michael back in New York to explain to you how government is broken and how we can fix the problem by adopting a series of reforms that enfranchise all Americans. Now, I'd like to introduce both Catherine and Michael. Catherine Gehl is a business leader, speaker, author, and political innovator. She was the president of Gehl Foods, a $250 million high-tech food manufacturing company in Wisconsin, where she led a transformational growth strategy, receiving multiple awards before selling the company in 2015, in part to dedicate more time to political reform. Michael Porter is an economist, researcher, author, advisor, speaker, and teacher. Throughout his lifetime career at Harvard Business School, he has brought economic theory and strategy concepts to bear on many of the most challenging problems facing corporations, economies, and societies. He is the author of 19 books and over 130 articles. Obviously, he has too much time on his hands. And is the most cited scholar in economics and business today. In this address, Catherine and Michael will discuss their groundbreaking research and analysis on and prescription for our political system. Now, Catherine originated this work in 2013. Her idea was to look at politics through the lens of competition and see and bring new thinking to shed new light on the systemic challenges of our politics, and is uniquely instructive at how to best transform the political system. In 2016, Catherine asked Michael to help co-author an article presenting this breakthrough analysis. The report was published by the Harvard Business School, and this work has been described as a brilliant piece of research by the Financial Times, a superb accomplishment by Congressman Mike Gallagher, and a new paradigm by Austin Ramirez, who's the CEO of Husco International. If I am allowed to describe this research, I would call it democracy changing, because I think it's that significant. Catherine and Michael continue to inform, engage, and motivate business people and leaders from across America in political innovation. They have a new book out in 2020. I've already signed up for it. So we look forward today to their presentation. Please join me in welcoming Catherine and Michael.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Michael. I am very happy to stand here because if I could do it all over again, I would be an attorney, especially if I could be sort of part of City Bar, which makes it sound even more fun. I'm going to start with a few bar-related questions, and they do require audience participation. So if you could help me out, that would be great. So how many people here drink beer or wine? Great, and keep your hands up if you are, in general, pretty darn satisfied with the choices that you have in the beer and wine marketplace. Wonderful. And hands down. Okay. Now, how many people here vote in the US? And please do keep your hands up if you are pretty darn satisfied with the products of the political marketplace, politicians or policies. Okay, we have a few. It is a democracy. But that is the reason why we're all here. Why, in America, do we have over 6,000 breweries and 3,000 wineries? And yet, when it comes to our political system, we can choose between door A or door B. And for many people, neither one is satisfactory. The answer is that unlike the beer and wine industry and the politics industry, we actually don't have healthy competition, innovation, or accountability. The best of what we might call free market politics. I could probably retitle our presentation, not this, politics industry, but just how can we make our politics as satisfying as our alcohol? And if you have some alcohol, it makes it more satisfying, actually. Okay, so there is so much talk all the time now about hyperpartisanship and a divided country. I want to start with something where there's pretty much broad agreement. Washington is broken. But as my former good friend, former Congressman Mickey Edwards said, and originally explained in a fabulous book, no matter how many times we say Washington is broken, it actually represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. In fact, Washington is working exactly how it's designed to work. Now, how can our political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? Well, the answer is that it's actually not designed for us. In fact, the system that we have today is not one that's enshrined or even primarily, derived from our Constitution. The system we have today has been designed and continuously fine-tuned by and for the benefit of two private gain-seeking organizations. And these are our two political parties plus their industry allies, which comprise a duopoly and what together we call the political industrial complex. And as you might imagine, the needs of the political industrial complex are not exactly aligned with the needs of the country. And that structure, that design, has created a huge problem, which we'll illustrate with a Venn diagram. Currently, there is virtually no intersection between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood of congresspeople getting reelected. So in other words, if America's elected representatives do their jobs the way we need them to, they're likely to lose those jobs, which is a crazy design. But fortunately, it's also optional. We can change the design, and those solutions are what we're going to talk about tonight. In 2016, I asked Michael to join me on this new approach to fixing our politics, which is using the tools of competition and industry analysis that he had originally developed and that have been the gold standard for decades to understand competition in for-profit industries, and which so many of you studied at Harvard Business School, and which I studied at Kellogg. Okay, I just want to admit that right now. But I'm very proud of it. I like to come speak to HBS people with my Kellogg degree. Using these tools to look at politics sheds new light on our problems because, in fact, politics has become a major industry that works like other industries. Our political problems are not due to a single cause, but rather to a failure of the nature of political competition that has been created. This is a systems problem. And the purpose of our work is very simple. We wanted to figure out precisely what it would take to change the system, not for the sake of change, not for better representation, not for a better democracy, but to change the system powerfully enough to change the results that the system regularly delivers. And the most powerful solutions center around the very foundation of our democracy, how we vote. The political innovations we will recommend to you tonight can break partisan gridlock and drive accountability for real solutions in the country. Now, it's really important to say that when we talk tonight, it's certainly all about politics, but it's not at all political. Michael is a Massachusetts Republican, lifelong. He makes me say Massachusetts Republican. I used to be a Democrat. Before that, I was a libertarian, and now I call myself a politically homeless, centrist independent. It's a long label, but it works for me. Now, the problem is not Democrats or Republicans. The problem is not even the existence of parties per se. The problem is not individual politicians, most of whom go to Washington, D.C. with a very deep-felt desire to serve. The problem is the system itself. So first, tonight, Michael's going to review what's at stake, and then I will be back to talk about why everything's screwed up, who is to blame, but most importantly, how we can fix it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and we're honored that all of you are here tonight, and it's a real joy to do this in such a hallowed space as this, with all these wonderful pictures staring at us. And they came from a different era than we're in now, and an era, frankly, that was much better in the political space. And so what I'd like to just talk about is, what's at stake first. And, I'm not a political scientist, and the last thing I thought I would ever work on was politics, I confess. But this journey actually started for me in 2010 when, as was said a minute ago, I began co-chairing the so-called U.S. Competitiveness Project at HBS. Many of you know about this project. Many of you filled out our surveys over the years. And we were concerned at the school about the depressing economic performance that we were seeing, really unprecedented economic performance we were seeing that started before the Great Recession and continues in many respects even today. I was thinking that we had the typical policy problem, but Catherine helped me understand that actually there was a lot more going on than that. Let me show you what we were finding. Here's the sort of survey of the results of the U.S. Competitiveness Project, and you can see a classic HBS kind of 2x2 matrix here. And what we see about the U.S. and our competitiveness, which is what we've concluded after many years of this work, is we have some terrific strengths. You see those in the upper right-hand corner here: entrepreneurship, universities, great capital markets, really quite high-quality management. But we face an increasing set of alarming economic weaknesses. A K-12 education system that is getting worse, believe it or not. Inadequate worker skills. We're no longer the most skilled workers in the world. Poor infrastructure, complex regulation, high-cost legal system, although lawyers are great, and high-cost health care. And there's more, and there's more. These economic problems have led to rising inequality in our society. We're all aware of that. To the fact that many Americans today are not earning a living wage, that the workforce participation in our economy is at a 40-year low. And we think that the true unemployment rate, based on our analysis, is closer to 10%, not 3.7%. The way they do the calculation is a little bit skewed. Now, if you look at our strengths, notice where they are, who's controlling those strengths? And the answer is the strengths are in the private sector. That's where universities are mostly in our society. That's where the capital markets are. That's who's managing companies. That's where entrepreneurship happens. But if we look at the weaknesses that are getting worse, who's responsible for those areas? And the answer is very clear. It's government. Those are all areas under the control and part of the job of government. And we actually asked our alumni what was the greatest economic weakness and economic problem facing America. And you can see on this chart in the lower left what they answered. Our political system. And frankly, that was a shocker to me. As a result of that, that we started thinking about this topic that I'd never thought about before. But thanks to Catherine, we got off to a running start. Now, to restore competitiveness, we tried something else. We put forward from the school what we call the 8-point plan. We identified the 8 most important policy steps that needed to be taken in America to get the economy moving in the right direction again. We took multiple trips to Washington. We met with hundreds of members of Congress. Every single member that we talked to agreed with the diagnosis. Every single member agreed with the recommendations. Nothing has gotten done. 0. There's been no real progress, in fact, on any of our key economic policy priorities in decades, not just the last 5 years. You might be thinking tax reform, but tax reform was highly partisan. It wasn't the kind of reform we really needed. And therefore, that's a success, but only in a very, very limited sense. Now, this was bad enough, but the story actually is worse than this. Because economics is only half of government's job, economic policy. Progress on the quality of life is just as important, even more important. It's essential to economic progress and also to the quality of life and the opportunities that our citizens have. We think of ourselves in America as a sort of social policy, quality of life leader. But we've really never been able to measure how well we are, how well we actually do. It was just kind of our lore that that's what we are. So I led in 2014 a team that created something called the Social Progress Index. And for the first time ever, we were able to objectively measure with independent data social, economic, and quality of life performance across a large number of countries. And so we could actually see where do we stand. And here I will show you some of the key findings. Now, we compare ourselves on this chart to our closest competitors, and those are the other advanced economies. And you know who they are. While we were a pioneer in many of these areas, now we've sunk to the bottom of all advanced economies. You see the numbers, 32 and 34 in child and maternal mortality, 32nd access to education, 34th in homicide rate, 25th in discrimination and violence towards minorities. And there are plenty of other problems, gun violence, political rights issues, unsafe water, immigration issues, and more and more and more. In fact, we are the only advanced country where social progress is actually declining. Now that we can measure how well our government is performing, the question is, of course, what do we do about it? Our government is not delivering the results that we need. All the political sideshow that goes on every day is not what matters. What matters is the results. What's happening to the country? Are we moving the country forward? I thought we had a policy problem. I thought we just didn't have the right policy, but when we got into this, it became clear that the policy wasn't the problem. We know what to do. We just can't do it. Something's blocking us from actually implementing good policy. And then I think my second hypothesis was, well, the problem is politicians, it's people. We're electing the wrong people, we have the wrong people in the jobs, and that is the real problem. But what we've learned is it doesn't matter what people we elect. Whoever gets elected and injected into this system is trapped in it. And we get the same result, no matter who we elect. What we did discover was that if we actually looked at politics as an industry, as Catherine has mentioned, and looked at what was driving the competition and what are the parties competing on and why are they doing that, that would help us understand the root causes of what's going on. And if we can't change these, we got a real problem in America. So let me turn it over to Catherine and to kind of discuss why this has happened. Our political system hasn't always been this way. It was once quite successful. But Catherine will talk a little bit about what's gone wrong and what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Whoops. Okay, so I would like to go back to what I said earlier, Washington is broken. As I mentioned, that's not actually the case. Washington is working exactly how it's designed to work. It's designed by and for the benefit of this political industrial complex, not for citizens, not for voters, and not for the public interest. So if we take a peek under the proverbial hood, we can see that politics actually operates much differently than how most of us have assumed. And I'm going to give you two quick real-life examples. So first of all, go back to 2009 when Joe Biden became vice president. His Senate seat was then open in Delaware, and I'm told that everybody in the state of Delaware already knew who was going to be the next senator from the state of Delaware. It was their multiple-term governor and congressman, Mike Castle. He was the most popular politician in the state. Mike Castle ran in his Republican primary, and he lost. It was shocking, but theoretically not insurmountable, because it's just the primary, and remember, Mike Castle is revered in Delaware, so he should just run as an independent in the general election, and then he would have won. But of course, none of us here tonight, or anywhere, have ever heard of a Senator Mike Castle. There was a slight problem. Delaware has a law called the sore loser law. And what that says is, if you lose in your party's primary, Democrat or Republican, you are not permitted to have your name on the ballot in the November general election. Fitness, popularity, experience, all completely immaterial. So the question to ask is, how many states? How many states have a sore loser law, crazy undemocratic law like this that effectively allows private political parties to control general election ballot choices? And the answer is 44. Now tonight, we are sitting in one of the few who doesn't have that law. So congratulations to New York and also to Connecticut. Nonetheless, it's an enormous problem, and even without the sore loser law, there are things that we all have to understand about partisan primaries. They may be publicly funded, but if you think about it, they're really selection processes for the standard bearer of private partisan organizations. And primaries are a key reason why so many people show up in the general election and think, I really don't love these choices that I have. Because most elections are really decided in the primary, especially in gerrymandered districts, and voters who turn out for partisan primaries tend to be more ideological than the electorate as a whole. Therefore, to make it through the primary, candidates often have to go further to the left or the right than voters as a whole really want. But even more alarming, the partisan primary influence extends beyond the electoral process to entirely corrupt the legislative process or actually governing. So imagine yourself for a moment as a politician. It's not just what you have to say to get elected. It's that once you're in office and you're presented with an opportunity to vote yes on, let's say, a landmark legislation, a bipartisan compromise bill on one of our largest national problems, maybe the ones Michael was showing us in the slide a moment ago, what are the operative questions that you have to ask yourself? Is this a good idea? Is this the right policy for the country? Is this what the majority of constituents in my district want? It's actually none of those. The question you ask is, am I going to make it back through my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that question is no, and it virtually always is on every issue of great significance, then all the previous important questions are virtually wholly irrelevant because a rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Now, occasionally, duty, principle might win the day, and you decide to vote yes anyway. So what happens next? Well, as many of you may know, primary, long ago, ceased to be just a noun. It's now an action verb, as in, we're going to primary you. And what that means is if you vote yes on this bill, and we don't like it, the leadership of your party, we're going to run someone further to your right if you're a Republican, further to your left if you're a Democrat, and take you out. Never has it meant that we're going to run a more rational, consensus, compromise-oriented candidate to your middle. Partisan primaries, combined with partisan gerrymandering, are two key tools that the duopoly uses to control the political process. And they effectively force our elected officials, both right and left, and obliterate any moderates. We can start to understand why so little gets done in Washington, D.C. So now, I'm going to give you a second example of our partisan system, and this one is not from elections, it's from actually governing. Because the duopoly also perverts governance by controlling what we call the legislative machinery, which are the rules, norms, and practices that dictate the process by which laws are actually made. So the Hastert rule, for example, is a particularly egregious example of party control taking precedence over the legislature's ability to work collectively, even when the country wants it. So I'll describe it for you. The Hastert rule has now become a well-accepted practice of the Speaker of the House, Democrats and Republicans. What it says is that the Speaker will not allow a floor vote on legislation unless a majority of the majority, which is to say the Speaker's party, supports that bill, even if a majority of the entire House would vote to pass it. So unless speakers ignore this practice, which they do from time to time, but rarely, even legislation supported by a majority of the country often has no chance of passing because there may never even be a vote in our democracy. There are lots of real-life consequences to this. So let's go to the 2013 government shutdown. It turns out that shutdown would have been entirely averted or ended earlier if then Speaker John Boehner had allowed a floor vote on legislation that was already passed by the Senate and was supported by a majority of the House, which is to say virtually all of the Democrats plus a minority of Republicans. And in fact, that shutdown ended only when the Speaker broke with his party and broke the Hastert rule to allow the vote. So effectively, this made-up rule, not even written down, cements majority party control in a legislature that's supposed to represent all U.S. citizens. And in this case, it cost the country $24 billion in a 16-day shutdown that 90% of citizens did not want from day one. So think about it in the context of your own organizations. If you want to solve your biggest problems, I suspect that one thing you might not do is bring everybody together like this and say, okay, we're going to really work hard, but quickly, before we get started, let's count off by twos, and we'll divide into warring teams, and then we'll get right to work. But effectively, that is Washington, D.C. every single day. Our founders warned against political parties to a man, and they were men. Might have been different if they weren't. Okay, not everybody thought that was funny. I kind of like it. John Adams said, "There is nothing which I fear so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other." Clearly, it's not exactly working like Schoolhouse Rock once taught me that it did. My daughter describes this situation best with a joke, and she's funnier than I am, so I'll share it with you. If con is the opposite of pro, then isn't Congress the opposite of progress? Oh, she always beats me. I don't say anything nearly that funny. All right, in a duopoly, the players advance their own interests instead of the public interest. What's unique about the politics industry as compared to almost every other industry is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the industry are the ones that themselves make the rules of the game. Most of us mistakenly think that the important rules of the game are set in the Constitution, but for the most part, that is not true. It turns out that most of the rules that govern the incentives really driving day-to-day behavior and legislation are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. Whoops. Oops. Technical difficulties.
Try it on the computer.
I'm set now. Thank you. For example, you have all heard of the pocket constitution, and here's mine. It's pretty small. There are in here 6 tiny paragraphs detailing how the House and the Senate should work. And someone is bringing me, this is the House Rules Book. 1,500 pages of legislative machinery. This is a book about how to divide up the spoils of power. It's a book that really entrenches partisanship in legislating. And not at all something that I would call best practices of problem solving. I am going to put it right over here on top of the Senate Rules Book and just leave it here so we can contemplate it and think of it perhaps as motivation to fix the legislative machinery. Because, as is always the case in all of our lives, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. And the net result of the rules of the game in politics is unhealthy competition. Unhealthy competition in elections and unhealthy competition in legislating. And the result of unhealthy competition in any industry is that customers are not well served. So thus, the actors in the political industry are thriving, and yet the American public has simply never been more dissatisfied. Just last fall, a new Gallup poll came out, and 61% of Americans think that a major third party is needed. And the percentage of Americans self-identifying as independent is at an all-time high, with 46% identifying as independents and only 27% as Democrats and 26% as Republicans. In any other industry this large, with this much consumer dissatisfaction and this much power and money to be made, some entrepreneur, probably someone from Kellogg, where I went, but maybe someone from HBS, some entrepreneur would see it as a phenomenal business opportunity, and they would create a new competitor responding to what customers want. But that simply doesn't happen in politics, because the duopoly works very well together, I'm going to try this, in one particular way, which is to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves jointly from new competition. They effectively collude to erect huge barriers to entry. Put another way, politics isn't broken, it's fixed. This looks like a promising antitrust case, and if I don't say what I'm about to say, someone will come up to me after to have that as the idea. But now you won't be surprised to know that ever so conveniently, antitrust legislation simply doesn't apply to the politics industry. And troublingly, there's no accountability for any of this. There's no accountability because the customer only has 2 choices. So the only thing that either party has to do to win is convince the average voter to either stay home or to vote for them because as the lesser of 2 evils, or because at least they say, therefore, what that voter believes. But what the parties don't have to do in this duopoly is to deliver results. Because no matter how disappointed you are, you still likely prefer what your side says therefore than what the one other choice says therefore. As a result, instead of results in the public interest, we get gridlock. This chart shows the percentage of salient issues that are deadlocked in Congress, and we see a relentless increase from 1947, leading to a high watermark of 74% of important issues gridlocked in 2014. And when we do get something done, it's partisan. Here we see a striking implication of the industry structure. So landmark legislation used to pass with bipartisan support. You'll see the combination of red and blue votes, beginning on the left for Social Security, highways, civil rights, welfare reform. But today, important legislation is passed only on partisan lines. So see all blue for health care and Dodd-Frank and all red for tax cuts. Now, when the other party retakes power, they focus not on improving, but on repealing. And this happens in part because there are no longer virtually any moderates left who can bridge the gap between the extremes of the two sides. My next slide shows the decline in moderates over time on both Republican and Democrat sides. And of course, everyone knows it's broken. Here we see the dramatic decline in trust in the federal government from 1958 to 2017. Now, if the competition in the politics industry were healthy, industry actors would be competing to advance the public interest, and they would be held accountable for that. But we know they're not, and the question is, why not? So for that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And now we're going to burrow a little bit deeper into how this all really works. And I can tell you, at least speaking for myself, I had no idea of any of this. It's not what we grow up thinking and learning. So in order to look at this industry, with Catherine's leadership, we came up with this idea that let's look at it as an industry. It's actually not a public institution. It's not defined in the Constitution. It's a business. It's an industry. These are private organizations. They're not public organizations. And they're competing to advance themselves. And as Catherine said, not us. So what we decided to do was use the tools of industry analysis to take apart this industry and understand really what was driving competition. So this should be a familiar chart, at least to the HBSers in the room. This is the so-called 5 forces. And this is a framework for looking at competition in any industry. And so what if we apply this to politics? What do we see here? Well, at the core of any industry is the rivals, the competitors. And in this industry, of course, that's the Democrats and the Republicans that are fighting it out, like Coke and Pepsi or any other industry. These two competitors are competing to do two things. First of all, they're competing to win elections. And secondly, they're competing to get their way in governing, to pass the legislation they want. This industry, as you all know, is a duopoly. A duopoly is an industry where there's only two dominant competitors. And we know from studying competition in lots of other industries, whenever we see a duopoly, strange things happen in terms of the nature of competition. And this is, of course, no exception. The first thing is that duopolies avoid head-to-head competition because they're really powerful and it gets destructive. So they're not going to go head-to-head. They also, when you have a duopoly, it's not just how they're competing, which we have to understand, but we have to also understand how they're cooperating. Because when there's only two, and they can cooperate to make the industry better, they will. And this is very common in this kind of situation. So we'll talk a little bit more about what they're doing in a moment. Now let's turn to the surrounding actors that you see in the political industrial complex. So let's go to the end buyer or the end customer. Who's the customer? Well, that's us. We're citizens. We're the customer. Or at least we should be the customer. But, of course, we got some questions about, are we really the customer? Not all citizens are equally important to the parties. This is something it's hard for us to take this, but we've got to understand this. All customers are not equal. These are very savvy competitors, and they, like all savvy competitors, prioritize the most profitable customers. The customers who will bring them the most reliable votes and the most money, which is the currency that they're competing for in their particular industry. Their most important customers are not average voters. The parties don't compete for the middle. Again, that's too zero-sum. They would be too accountable if they were both competing for the same thing. They'd be accountable if one was better than the other. Now, though, what they do instead is a classic strategy of dividing up the voters. They create two almost totally separate groups of voters, and their core voters consist of, number one, partisan primary voters. That relatively small number of people that shows up in the partisan primaries, Catherine talked about, more ideological, more partisan, those are one set of the core customers. The parties are riveted on those voters. And the other core customers for the parties are special interest, and there's lots of special interest on lots of issues, but they focus on those that are aligned with their ideology. So the left looks for the special interests that are aligned with their ideology, the right vice versa. And that's who they're concentrating on. It's these customers, the partisan primary voters and the special interest aligned with their ideology, that they serve, that they're trying to deliver value for. And they've come up with a lot of ways to deliver value that are somewhat scary to us as the average citizen. The parties don't focus on delivering value to the average voter, to us. That's not who they're trying to serve. As Catherine said, with only two choices, they don't worry about us. They worry about their partisans. They worry about their core. Now, the other surrounding actors are also important to competition. The channels are the way in which the parties get to the voters. You can see as a direct voter engagement. There's advertising, there's the media, there's the social media. And the story here is that the channels used to be more independent. But what's happened now is the parties have been able to control and divide the channels. So media are getting more divided. There's the media that covers the right, the media that covers the left. The parties control the ground game. The parties control these various ways of reaching customers. Social media, the parties are masters at social media and drowning us with emails and marketing stuff. So the channels are sort of reinforcing the partisan competition for the partisan voters that the parties have aligned with. Going farther to the left, we have suppliers. Like every other industry, this industry has suppliers. These are inputs they need to run elections and govern and all that other stuff. Here are the suppliers you see are candidates, campaign talent, voter data. Data here is really crucial, just like in every other industry, to winning elections, polling, and so forth. Think tanks provide ideas and policy thoughts. And then there's, of course, lobbyists who are spreading out ideas to try to influence legislation and what people actually do. The fascinating thing about this industry is that the suppliers have also been divided. There are Republican campaign managers, there are Republican voter data firms, there are Republican think tanks, leaning think tanks, there are Republican lobbyists, and then there's Democrats of all of the above. So each party goes to battle with a partisan group of suppliers that just reinforce the partisanship and the divisiveness of the process. Now, a very critical part of any industry that Catherine's already mentioned is the barriers to entry. And here, again, the parties have been very sophisticated in setting the rules the right way. Despite this lousy performance, the last new party we had of any significance was in 1854. Okay, it's been a long time. How was that? Because the barriers to entry are incredibly high. Incumbency, economies of scale, locking up the suppliers, capturing the channels, and multiple others. And a lot of it has to do with the rules that the parties have set for how to do elections and govern. For example, there's a fundraising rule made up by the parties that says that a single donor can contribute $847,500 per year to a national political party. But if they happen to want to contribute to an independent, you're only allowed to give $5,400 per 2-year election cycle. And if you want to do the math, that's 313 times more to the party candidate than the independent. And that's just one of many rules. The parties took control of the presidential debates in 1984. The League of Women Voters was kicked out. No independents are welcome in the presidential debates anymore. The duopolies have then colluded and agreed on the rules that will make the industry more attractive for them, not us, for them. And then finally, in any industry, there are substitutes. These are the disruptors. This is Uber versus the taxi industry. People coming in with a different way of competing. Unfortunately, in this industry, you can't really do that. You've got to follow the rules that are in place. You can't invent your own rules in government-related things like politics. So the net result is there are no substitutes. Independents are the logical substitute, but they haven't made much headway, as we've discussed. So what are the implications of this? And I think there's 4 of them that we believe are truly horrifying, and we're experiencing. Number 1, political competition is not on solutions. It's about ideology. That's what determines what the parties are willing to do and what they're willing to pass. What we know about ideology is it's too simple. It's a cartoon of the reality of the world. Neither free trade or protectionism, which is kind of an ideological choice, is the right answer. It's both. You've got to combine multiple factors and understand, where the priorities lie. And you've got to blend and integrate and compromise to develop any good legislation that actually works. That's not what the parties really do. They are focused. They would rather not compromise any ideological principles in order to get something done. They don't want to do that because if they compromise, they're going to alienate their core customers, and that's the last thing they want to do. You can see that the parties also don't necessarily want to solve our problems. Why is immigration festering and festering and festering and festering? Because both sides understand that if they solve it, then their core customers lose their energy to support the party. And they get alienated. And that's the last thing they want to do in their competition. And just finally, and very quickly, the parties have infiltrated not just the legislative process, which we've talked about, but they've also infiltrated our executive agencies in government. We now used to have a lot of civil servants in key positions in our executive branch. Now we have almost all political appointees, where the qualification is party loyalty, loyal partisan. The parties have infiltrated our regulatory agencies, the FDA, the FTC, all the agencies now. The commissioners who run the agencies, they're all political appointees that are highly partisan. That's the qualification now to be a commissioner of one of these agencies. The courts, I hesitate to say that in this hallowed ground, but our judicial system is now partisan. There's lots of evidence on that. The judges that are appointed now are not the ones who are the most even-handed and open to all points of view. They have to be vetted as loyal partisans to one side or the other, whoever's making that appointment at that particular moment of time. And there's no countervailing forces here. We don't see anything going on that's going to change this naturally. There's no kind of self-correcting going on. We're going to have to change it. So in order to talk about how to do that, I'd like to call Catherine back up, and this is why all this work has happened, because we got to understand what to do.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, this is it. We've arrived at the solutions section. Because, of course, the theory is helpful, and thank you for listening to all of that, because we really do that in order to support what we'll now propose to you as the most powerful solutions. So let's summarize the theory of change. In any game, board games, sports games, serious games like politics, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. So you could change the rules in basketball and get a faster or slower game. You can put in a three-point line and change the way the game is played and the players that are successful at it. You also alter the outcomes, and you can change the rules of the game in any industry and get different behavior. So put a tariff on something 50 pounds or more, and everything will be 49.9 pounds very effectively and very quickly. Now let's remember that all the rules of the game of politics, very few of them are in the Constitution. The problem with the rules we've made since the Constitution is that most of them, of the elections machinery and the legislative machinery, have been made up to serve partisans, not to solve problems. So to transform the system, we have to re-engineer the rules of the game to incent healthy competition on dimensions that matter to the public interest. And it is both that simple and that hard. What we need is political innovation. Political innovations exist at the intersection of another Venn diagram, powerful and achievable. So for us, an innovation is defined as powerful only if enacting it would address a root cause of the unhealthy competition and drive accountability for actual solutions that move the country forward. And an innovation is achievable only if we can theoretically measure success in years, not decades, which is to say, for example, that constitutional amendments need not apply for this Venn diagram. The phenomenal news is that there are several exciting political innovations that are right in this sweet spot. They're just new to most of us. So let's take a look. Two areas of innovation are on the critical path: changing the elections machinery, changing the rules of the game for how we vote, and then changing the legislative machinery. That's all of this. But tonight, I'm only going to focus on the elections machinery, because changing how we vote is the most powerful innovation that we can achieve much sooner than you might assume. So let me back up for a moment. There are two critical structural problems that we want to address in our existing elections to change the results. First, the partisan primaries, which I already talked about, but here's a way to think of it. Effectively, the partisan primary creates an eye of the needle, that proverbial eye of the needle, through which no problem-solving politician can pass. And it makes it, frankly, virtually impossible for legislators to keep their focus on the public interest rather than the ideological flanks of their respective side of the duopoly. Now, the second challenge we have structurally is plurality voting. So we never think about this. It's just normal to us. But for a moment, let's remember that in the U.S., elections can be won by having the most votes. But you don't necessarily have to have a true majority. For example, in a three-way race, a candidate can win with only 34% of the vote, which would mean that 66% of the voters actually preferred someone else. And what's really important about plurality voting is that it turns out that it is an enormous barrier, the single greatest barrier, greater than those fundraising rules, to new competition for two reasons. First, the spoiler argument. So sometimes we don't vote for the candidate we really want out of fear that our vote will inadvertently help elect the candidate that we like the least. Think back to 2016. You can't vote for Jill Stein because it'll take votes away from Hillary, spoil the election for Hillary, and accidentally help elect Donald Trump. You also may not vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, because you'll take votes away from Donald Trump, spoil the election for the Republican, and accidentally help elect Hillary. The spoiler argument is wielded against all potential competition for the duopoly. And it's, as I said, the single greatest reason why we don't see any new competition. Because most potential competitors never even make it to the starting line. They can't compete when they're faced with this spoiler argument, which is the pressure that they get, as in, you may not come into this race as an independent because the only thing you're going to do is spoil the election for the candidate you're the closest to. You can't possibly win. So we see this effect in keeping competitors out of the race. We saw it in this previous election cycle where Howard Schultz wanted to run as an independent for president, but he was considered to be a spoiler for the Democrats, and so he can't run. We see it sometimes talked about with Mayor Bloomberg, your former mayor, who thinks of running as an independent, but then he would be a spoiler. If we think about it, politics is the only industry where we're regularly told that less competition is better for the customer. And we don't have to think that Howard Schultz would have been the best president or that Mayor Bloomberg would have been the best president to know that there's something wrong with a system where talented, accomplished people making their case to the American public are considered a detriment to that system. The election innovation that we propose, called Top 5 RCV, solves both of these critical problems and will fundamentally change what politicians are incented to do and our ability to hold them accountable for actually solving problems, for actually delivering results. Top 5 RCV requires 2 changes, one for the primary and one for the general election. First, Top 5 primaries. Let's just throw out the broken partisan primary system and change to a Top 5 primary. Here's how that works. So you will go to the polling place on primary day, and instead of needing to choose whether you're voting in the Republican primary or the Democrat primary, everybody votes in the same primary, and independents get to vote too. There's one ballot. All candidates, regardless of party, and including independents, are on the same ballot. You pick your favorite. Polls closed, votes are counted. The top 5 finishers automatically advance to the general election. Top 5 primaries eliminate the eye of the needle problem and thus allow legislators significantly more freedom to legislate in the public interest and to solve tough problems. The second thing we're going to do in the general election is throw out our system of plurality voting and change to ranked choice voting so that we'll always have true majority winners. Let me explain. So now in the general election, the top 5 finishers from the primary are automatically on the ballot. And now when I go to vote in the general, I pick my favorite, just like always. And then if I want to, I can also pick second choice, third choice, fourth choice, last choice. Here's my ballot in a ranked choice election. Alexander Hamilton is my favorite because I like the musical. And Abigail Adams is my second choice, as you might imagine. George is my third, Thomas Jefferson my fourth, and John Adams, is last for me. Now the polls close, and the first place votes are counted. And if someone gets a true majority over 50%, then the election's over, and that candidate has won. But if nobody has a true majority, then the candidate who came in last, who came in 5th place, is automatically eliminated from the race. And if you had selected that candidate as your first choice and that candidate's no longer in the race, now you have your second choice vote counted instead. The votes are counted again. The process continues with last place candidates being eliminated until we elect a true majority winner. It's basically a series of runoffs. But instead of having to come back for another election, you cast all your votes at once. Ranked choice voting eliminates the spoiler argument and the wasted vote argument and ensures that we always elect the candidate with the greatest appeal to the greatest number of voters. And these are not, by the way, crazy new ideas. All the way back in 2002, Alaska had a referendum to implement ranked choice voting in their elections, and a famous politician recorded a robocall telling the citizens to vote yes on this initiative. Let's listen.
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for ballot measure 1 on August 27th. As a presidential candidate and as a senator, I've worked hard to open up the political process for all Americans. Ballot measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters. Please vote yes on measure 1 on August 27th.
And also in 2002, in Illinois, where I lived, we had Illinois Senate Bill 1789, which proposed ranked choice voting for statewide and congressional primaries. The sponsor, then State Senator Barack Obama. John McCain and Barack Obama, two talented politicians and devoted public servants who absolutely knew how the game is played. They were ahead of their time on political innovation, but I believe that now that time has come. So you all have a ballot on your chair. We're having an election for the favorite sports teams in New York State. And if you fill that out, we will calculate the results and send you the results, but we're also hoping you'll put your name on the back and that we can keep you engaged. Those of you from Connecticut and New Jersey can also participate. We won't call it foreign influence. And this innovation, top 5 RCV, will powerfully alter the incentives. And in our view, the innovation needs to be both. We need both top 5 primaries and ranked choice voting general elections. So let's quickly reimagine Congress post-election machinery reform. Now, the exact same person has the exact same opportunity to vote yes on the landmark legislation, the bipartisan bill, solving a huge issue. And the exact same person now says, well, under the old system, I never would have made it back through my primary if I voted for this. But under the new system, I'm pretty sure I can be in the top 5. I'm the incumbent, I'm popular, I'm well known, and then in the general, with a combination, by appealing to my entire district, with a combination of first and second place, maybe third place votes, I will be able to craft a win. Consider the benefits of this system. Number 1, elected officials now owe their election to a broader group of voters and are incented to be responsive to their entire district rather than a narrow swath of primary voters and special interests and donors. 2, the existing incentives for scorched earth campaigning and scorched earth committee hearings are dramatically reduced. 3, moderates have a chance, but only if that's what voters want. 4, the general election now becomes the most important election, as it certainly should be. And 5th, and most importantly, the barriers to entry for the new competition that could hold actors in any industry accountable for results are diminished, and this will lead to healthy competition and accountability to serve the public interest. So let's revisit our initial Venn diagram. So remember this one. Under the current rules of the game, there's no intersection between acting the public interest and the likelihood of getting reelected. But here it is with the solution. We implement the innovation top 5 RCV, and we create that intersection so that the actors in the politics industry are incented to do what we as a country need them to do, and that's the power of political innovation. So what's next? Well, we need to pass top 5 RCV across the country. And the US Constitution delegates virtually everything about elections to the states individually. So we need to do this state by state 50 times. And we change it through legislation, through the Assembly and the governor, or through citizens' initiatives. Now that's, of course, the macro what's next. But what's next for each of us individually and business leaders? Well, we need to get engaged. And I talk about join, fund, and evangelize. So first of all, you've got to join. Join the campaign for top 5 RCV in your state. Found one if there isn't one. It's an incredibly exciting time right now because there are campaigns being created across the country. We have campaigns in my home state of Wisconsin, in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Alaska, California, and right here in New York City, there is a voter referendum to implement ranked choice voting in the city primaries on November 5th. Do I have that right, November 5th? So make sure to vote yes. Make sure to vote, and vote yes, I should say. So, democracy innovations are no longer just theoretical. Dozens of states have already won gateway reforms, such as open primaries, top 2 primaries, nonpartisan gerrymandering. And here in New York, Reform Elections Now, who organized tonight along with City Bar and HBS, has been working across the state for 2 years, and we can give your contact information to them. Leadership Now is a nationwide network which was founded by HBS alums, and they're working nationally on many of these innovations. And a little over a year ago, the state of Maine passed ranked choice voting by referendum. The results came in after midnight, and I actually woke up my 12-year-old daughter at her request because she knew, because I told her, that this was the most important election of her lifetime to date. The second thing we have to do is fund these efforts to get them over the finish line. And everybody asks what's it going to take. It's a very important question. I believe that political philanthropy, as my friend David Crane describes it, a special interest for the general interest, offers the best potential ROI of any philanthropic investment out there today. I want to scale it for you. The dollars aren't actually prohibitive. Signers of the Bill and Melinda Gates Giving Pledge have collectively pledged almost $300 billion to philanthropy, and all Americans annually give $400 billion. The cost to deliver top 5 RCV per state, well, it's anywhere from $5 million in a small legislative state to $25 million in a large referendum state. So if we take an aggressive average of $15 million across 20 states, that gives us $300 million. $300 million is less than 5% of the billions that were spent on federal elections in 2016 alone. And yet, $300 million for top 5 RCV is far more likely to sustainably impact the trajectory of the country and the effectiveness of $4 trillion of government spending. That is the definition of powerful and achievable. So if anybody's interested in becoming a political innovation philanthropist, you let me know. Finally, we have to evangelize. Consider this, if you had a close family member or friend that was in a terrible situation, you became aware of a solution to their problem, you'd really stop at nothing to deliver it to them. And our democracy demands the same passion. So I am here to tell you that it's time to talk politics again at family gatherings, at business, at cocktail parties, everywhere really. And why not? Because what we're bringing to the table now is truly nonpartisan and truly optimistic, which is so different from the dialogue that we often have the opportunity to have around politics. Now, I want you guys to know that I personally have a 100% success rate with all my airplane seatmates over the last year. And I've now advanced to grading myself. I get an A if I get to show the Venn diagram before we even take off. I did not get an A this time, but I got it done. So what can I say? I'm really all in, and I hope that many of you are going to be all in too. In a minute or so, we'll be done, and the last slide will give you our website, which has a lot of resources on it, and please fill out these ballots. I hope you'll be in touch with us to take this action. You can also, thank you, Peter, for talking about our book. You can pre-order it. This makes my publisher very happy if I show this. But let's close by thinking back. Historically, the American political system was a critical foundation of the United States' success. And yet now, it really stands in the way of virtually every important issue we need to address. Yet we have every reason to be optimistic, perhaps even profoundly optimistic, because the reasons for our dysfunction are not a mystery. The path forward is clear, and we actually have the power to change these rules. This country was founded on the greatest political innovation of modern times, and political innovation remains the key to our future. So I want to close with an invitation to action. Thomas Jefferson is said to have said, my HBS fact checker said he didn't really say it, but he should have. We don't have American government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate. Now, for me, I always thought that meant that I needed to participate by voting. But it turns out that it means we also have to participate in the design of the rules of this game. Changing the rules of the game to incent healthy competition opens whole new possibilities. So imagine what it could be like. Imagine our political system restored to order. Imagine our elected representatives now in a position to tackle our greatest challenges. Imagine our democracy reinvigorated, returning to the democracy that we grew up believing that we had. Once again, a beacon to the world. It's really all possible. Reclaiming the promise of our republic, this great American experiment, is the challenge of our times. Please join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine and Michael. I think it's certainly enlightening for all of us. And one of the things, our gang of 7, I'm Michael Otten, and I'm one of the original gang from a year ago that got engaged and moved forward with this. And we felt it would be useful to have a panel discussion, and particularly to put the optimism in the context of history. The change has happened in the past, it can happen in the future, and it is necessary and is part of our evolution as a country. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce for the panel discussion our moderator, Pulitzer Prize winner Cheryl Wu-Dunn, and NYU history professor Timothy Naftali, who will provide additional context for our evening. Cheryl Wu-Dunn is a co-founder of Full Sky Partners, a consulting firm focused on socially driven ventures in technology and healthcare, and is senior managing director at Mid-Market Securities in New York. The first Asian American reporter to win a Pulitzer Prize, Wu-Dunn is co-author of A Path Appears Half the Sky, Thunder from the East, and China Wakes. She and her co-author, Nicholas Kristof, have a forthcoming book, Tightrope, about the struggles of the American working class, which will be out in January of 2020. Previously, Wu-Dunn was a vice president at Goldman Sachs, a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and a director of the Times Strategic Planning Department. She's a former member of the Board of Trustees at Princeton University and trustee emeritus at Cornell University. Wu-Dunn holds a BA from Cornell, an MPA from Princeton, and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Timothy Naftali is a presidential historian who also writes on international affairs and the history of espionage and counterterrorism. Currently a clinical associate professor of public service and of history, Naftali directs the New York University's undergraduate public policy program. Naftali was the first federal director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, where he curated a nationally recognized, nonpartisan, permanent gallery on Watergate. He earlier served as a historical consultant to the 9/11 Commission, and his books include One Hell of a Gamble, Khrushchev, Castro, and Kennedy, 1958 to 64, a study of the Cuban Missile Crisis with Alexander Fursenko, George H.W. Bush, and most recently, Impeachment, an American History with John Meacham, Peter Baker, and Jeffrey Engel. Naftali has been a CNN presidential historian since June 2016 and also appears regularly in historical documentaries, such as the 2000s and American Dynasties, The Kennedys. Cheryl and Tim, can I ask you to come over to this side and let you take over the meeting from here?
And help out your sight lines here so everyone can see the panelists.
Hi. Well, that was a real tour de force, Catherine and Michael. Really a wonderful presentation and full of so much detail and fascinating, pieces of solutions and knowledge. So I am really glad that I don't have to give the first reaction, because I'm going to let Tim give the first comment, reaction and some context based on his research.
From here or there? Either way. Right. Go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm always comfortable.
So, first of all, I think top 5 primary and ranked choice make perfect sense.
Oh.
But I wonder if that's enough. After all, maybe we're just very nervous because there was this argument for a long time that you just needed to elect somebody with business experience and the country would be in good shape. But what happened was they chose a small businessman, and that's the problem. If they'd chosen someone who'd actually run a large business corporation with managerial understanding, the whole thing would be different. I'm actually an optimist by nature, and I'm going to tell you something that I believe is a source of optimism, but it's going to be slightly different from the argument that Catherine and Michael have made. I don't think our successes, economic successes, technological successes, social successes in the modern era have been a product of a functioning political system. I think if you look at our history, more often than not, we've had a dysfunctional political system. And after all, we had a civil war, for goodness sakes. If our political system were that good, it wouldn't have collapsed 100 years after this country started. We've actually managed to do very well despite a political system that I think is still very, very good, but has real flaws. Let me give you an example. There is a myth about bipartisanship that you hear all the time, about how the country worked really well. Let me tell you about bipartisanship. There was enormous bipartisanship between 1938 and 1964 in this country. It was bipartisanship because Southern Democrats and Republican conservatives worked together to ensure that the following public and well-respected bills didn't pass: minimum wage, meaningful civil rights, hospital insurance. The American people, time and time again, in polls, supported these. But you had a bipartisan coalition that created a deadlocked Congress for 30 years. Now, if we were in 1958, we would be making the same argument about our dysfunctional political system as we are today. Now, but America was moving forward in the 1950s. It was seeing social change, although not as much as in the 60s. So the issue is, maybe we have a tendency as Americans to get wrapped up in our problem du jour and think that it's a crisis that is unprecedented in our history. We are more partisan, but maybe some of the challenges are not simply, and I agree, all of I didn't go to HBS, but I guess barriers to entry that you were describing. I'm a humanist. I was across the river in Cambridge, the Charles. We talked. I used to run on the other side. I saw the beach do it. But I think there are a number of other issues that we as people join a crusade for a better democracy, and I'm not making a political argument or an ideological argument, I want to mention a few things that have happened very quickly. A couple of things. One, the trust in government issue. You notice that line? We've never recovered from the loss in trust in government. And that loss was because of Vietnam and Watergate, and then an argument that was made over and over again, largely by one party, that government can never work. So we have a generation of Americans who've grown up that believe that if you're in government, you're a loser, that government is a welfare program, that experts don't go into government. So we've actually discouraged people who think programmatically from even running for election. So that it's not just an issue of the primaries, it's also the fact that the people who serve, who choose to be in government, are not problem solving. That's one. Number
Well, actually,
two,
can I interrupt you right there, because I actually want to pick up on that and
Okay.
ask them a question, so, and then we'll get back to some of the
All right, sure.
comments, yes. So, Catherine and Michael, I'm very interested in the breadth of what you have, discussed, but I want to pose this idea that, in many ways you could argue that the system was working because it allowed someone like Trump, who was a total outsider, to rise, he, flip from Democrat to Republican, to rise throughout and win the party, and the people had their say. I mean, maybe he didn't win the popular vote, but he won the vote by a lot of people who were dissatisfied. So why wouldn't you argue that the system in many ways did work? We haven't seen that happen in a long time.
So, can I talk into this mic? Yeah, it seems to be working. You can hear me? Okay. No? This one?
just bring
Okay.
it over.
Okay. So Trump's election, his essentially his takeover of the Republican Party actually supports this thesis, which is to say that Trump originally considered running as an independent. He considered running years ago with Perot's nascent party after the 92, 94 elections, actually 92, 96, sorry. And he couldn't do that because the barriers to entry were too high for anything other than a Republican or a Democrat. So his only choice was to come in and try to win one of these two primaries, which is considered to be the only choice that a Howard Schultz or a Mayor Bloomberg would have as well. So no, I don't think that being satisfied with two candidates, even if, you can have an outsider come in and take over one of these, gives us what we need in any way.
Well, but you can say that an outsider, doesn't matter how, you don't necessarily have to have a third party. We did have Jill Stein too, but can actually come in. You have 17 candidates, in the Democratic primary right now, and there's a wide breadth. And the polls, when they take polls, they're not just polling primary voters, they're polling people, in general. I mean, it's a panel of random selected adults, supposedly, and they're favoring, the leading candidate. So I don't know how, you are getting some representation of people's attitudes.
You're getting some representation in the primaries, but I want to say a couple things. First of all, the innovations we talk about are not designed to address challenges in our presidential election system. We're very focused on Congress, which is, of course, its own branch of government, and we think in many ways the most systemically dysfunctional. Okay, the American presidency is a bit more about the person who's in it, whereas this is systemically dysfunctional. Nonetheless, I firmly believe that both parties would do well to have ranked choice voting in their primaries to help narrow the field in a way that doesn't leave them with a plurality winner. So if you go back to 2016, Donald Trump won all those initial primaries with plurality. He didn't win a majority, meaning most people still wanted someone other than him. It's just that the Donald Trump voters were divided among other candidates. And so ranked choice voting in primaries is a better way to come to consensus on who would be the best standard bearer. But I still don't believe it would be helpful in our country, even if you had a consensus Democratic candidate and a consensus Republican candidate. That still would leave us two choices. It would still leave one here, and we need more competition than that. Although, I'll say one last thing. I have no problem with Republicans or Democrats. I disagree with John Adams that we shouldn't have parties. I think parties serve a really important purpose. Here's the problem. I don't want two parties to be guaranteed to continue to be the only two competitors even when nobody likes them. So I just want the threat of new competition, and then we'll see what happens and what the voters want.
Tim, do you have a comment?
Well, I would like to take issue with the argument that the parties now contest power through ideology, because I want you to tell me which party is protectionist, believes in deficit spending, in withdrawing from the world. Which party is that? Right now, it's the Republican Party. If I had said this to you 4 years ago, you would have said, oh, you're talking about George McGovern's Democratic Party. So I don't think, I think we're learning that ideology doesn't matter. No, now, which means we have to think about how Americans interact with the political system. I think one area, and I don't have the answer, sorry, I wish I did, but I think we're forgetting that people are motivated by emotion and cultural issues. And so I'm not sure, I would love to believe that we would get to yes, that we would get to solutions for our problems, but I'm not sure Americans agree, A, on the problem, and B, on the solution, and I think what they think about the solution could change every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on what they're being blasted by the web and on TV, which means we have a public education challenge more than anything else, because you can give people more choices at the ballot box, but if they don't actually know what they want, it won't matter, will it?
Well, so, Michael, let me ask you, how much, if you did change, the top 5 primaries, and you also changed you implemented ranked choice voting, how much do you think you would bring about, how would you measure it, and how much change do you think you would bring about in the political system, in the political process? How do you measure this?
Well, I think you'd have to measure, voting patterns and who was elected and what they stood for and the ability to compromise. Let me go back to what the professor said. If you look at, we actually have data on partisanship over the last 200 years in America. It's pretty carefully done by political scientists, and partisanship goes up and down. It was actually at a peak in the Gilded Age, which was in the late 1800s. And that peak is roughly the same as we have today. Okay, so we've had extreme partisanship before, we had it today. What happened in the Gilded Age was that Americans got so fed up that they changed virtually all the rules of the day. And we had a wonderful period when those rules were fair and supporting, competition and compromise and collaboration. We made a lot of progress in this country. There's lots of evidence on that. What we found in our data was around the 1960s, and this goes pretty well with your timeline, around the 1960s, rule changes started proliferating that the parties put in that put us back into the partisan war that we are in now. But I do want to make it clear that America has done a lot of great policy. We've gotten a lot of wonderful things done. We invented a lot of things. We pioneered a lot of things. We've had a tremendous economy for a long time. And so the idea that somehow we've been in a partisan war the whole time and haven't been able to get things done, that's just not the right idea.
Can I respond? This is an issue I have with my political science colleagues. And this is an issue I have with my political science colleagues. Michael, you're referring to a change in the 1960s. Let me tell you what that was called. It was called the Civil Rights Act. Sorry. It's called the Civil Rights Act. Let me tell you about the change. And then what happens is the functioning Congress, all right, which was bipartisan, was a Congress that couldn't raise minimum wage, that wasn't willing to support hospital insurance, was not willing to support any meaningful civil rights. It's just there was a rule change that's done in the Rules Committee in the early 60s, was to make it possible to bring more legislation to the floor, which made it possible in a very short period of time to have the Great Society and the Civil Rights Acts. So in the 1960s was an opportunity where you had a moment of great change, then it stopped Because in this country, what we have real change, and then we go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1, that's the way it works. So, but our political science friends say bipartisanship. Yeah, you had bipartisanship and you had stagnation in Congress and deadlock. So all I'm trying to make an argument to all of you is, don't accept this argument that bipartisanship means, and it's not from the liberal perspective, liberal or Republican, or not, liberal or conservative. The periods of innovation, all right, are not necessarily when you have bipartisanship in Congress. That's all I'm saying, if you look at it historically.
So, Cheryl, may I? So I want to agree with Tim that the situation is much more complex than what we shared with you in, this short period of time. And there are many more things that we need to do. What we propose to you, as excited as I am about it, does not create some kind of utopia. Which brings me to Churchill's quote, which you'll perhaps have heard of, that democracy is the worst form of government out there, except when compared to all the others. What we're proposing does not create a new kind of democracy, in the sense of democracy is messy and hard. And with these innovations, democracy will absolutely still be messy and hard. But now we have messy and hard with the possibility of a certain number of good results to show for it. And that's where we want to go. And I'll say about competition, what we're trying to do is inject competition into the system. And it's not necessarily about changing who gets elected, and it's not about everything being done bipartisan. It's about allowing competitive forces, free market politics, to put pressure on anybody serving for results. And here's how that can work. Go to '92 when Perot ran. He didn't win. He only got 19% in the general election. He got 0 electoral votes. And yet, what did we get out of competition? We as a country got the balanced budgets of the Clinton administration because, in large part, Perot ran on those debt and deficit charts. Do you guys remember those? And he put that issue on the table. And neither side of the duopoly wanted to cede the opportunity to lead on this issue that 19% of the public was willing to waste their vote on, of Perot, so they were both incented to work together to drive that. That's what competition does. It doesn't have to change who wins. It doesn't have to force everybody to work together. It has to put pressure on from the public for results.
Right, so no, I appreciate that, but that's why I'm actually trying to get from you some response on how much change you think that implementing something that, ranked choice voting or, top 5 primaries, because if we're going to spend our time, on, a couple of these solutions, we want to make sure it's a bang for your buck. So why that as opposed to let's try and re-enfranchise, people who should be enfranchised. So, there are, areas where there's suppression of voting. Why aren't those challenges? Or gerrymandering, and I know you do talk about gerrymandering. Those are huge issues as well.
Yeah, Cheryl, that's a really good point. I mean, first of all, we're democracy, so it should be as easy as possible for everybody to exercise their right to vote. Why don't we put that as our first our first priority? Here's why. Because what we're looking for in a complex system is where are the points of leverage? Where are the innovation, the intervening opportunity that's available to us, meaning what's powerful and achievable. So we say, well, we can't, make it mandatory for everybody to vote. And also, what difference would it make in results if everybody voted and they still had only 2 things to choose between? So we believe that, for example, to get to more higher voter participation, the best thing to do is to make the votes matter, to make it worth people's time to vote, and then we can combine this healthy debate that you'll have in the top 5 primary with reforms that would make it easier for people to register. Now, quickly about your point that what can we expect, how much change can we expect? Again, it's somewhat the same answer, which is it won't be some perfect utopia where we solve everything, but we can expect less gridlock. We can expect the big issues to be part of the dialogue and to have more views expressed. So this takes some time. Now that you would have 5 candidates in any election, there'll be 5 different viewpoints expressed, and even candidates that, quote, lose come in last, we will have understood where the public stands on that issue. So, for example, I would say that with climate change, you might have had 20 years ago, if you had top 5 RCV, some crazy lady run as the climate change candidate, and she would have gotten 2% of the vote every time, and that's it. And then gradually she'd get like 3, 7, 10. She may never win, this crazy climate change lady. But as more people would choose to vote on that issue, that would put that topic into the discourse. And so the results we're going to get depend on what the public wants. And what I expect is that there will be results that reflect what American citizens want more than we have now, because now there's no translation between what the vast majority of people want and what the government is willing to do.
Let me just make a comment there. I think we're somehow getting too much looking back at things that are hard to be clear about. We know very clearly what's happening right now. We know very clearly that both parties would rather not do anything than compromise with an important thing that the other party's interested in. This happens all the time. That's what gridlock means. We're not willing to play the game and get something done, even if it's not perfect, even though it doesn't fit our ideology. I disagree. I think ideology is pervasive, and the parties are different, and they want different things, and they have different beliefs. I think they have taught the public ideology. The public is hugely confused about what they should want, what they should expect. But the point is, right now, we're not delivering anything. Zero. We have no progress on any important economic policy issue. We have systematic decline in every social policy area that I mentioned. And so clearly, if there's no ideology and everybody's willing, it's just it doesn't matter if you're partisan or not, then why can't we do anything? We believe that the key drivers are, number one, the primary system creates polar partisans. You can't succeed if you're not a polar partisan. So you start with a bunch of legislators that are that way. And then the voting system means that somebody like Trump can win an election without getting a majority. And so it allows somebody to kind of hopefully build in this.
So that's the electoral system. That's
the RCV. And with the RCVs is the general election. So we think those are the 2 most powerful tools we have right now, where we are now, that will almost certainly make a difference. If the primaries are structured differently, where to win a primary you have to appeal to a lot of voters, not just the 5% of voters that show up to vote in the primary, who are the people that are most ideological, which is the way it is now. If you have to appeal to everybody to get through this top 5 primary, we think that can't help but give us some help. And then if you have to win a majority to be the winner in the general, that is going to allow people to have to think about everybody and not just their little narrow set of partisans, which is the way the system works now.
Tim, you want to say something, or otherwise I'll ask a question?
Why don't you ask a question?
Okay. So on that point, in terms of the top 5 primaries, if you look at California, it's a very liberal state. If I were in the out party there, I'd be very frustrated because it's very difficult. The top 5 are all going to be liberal Democrats. I mean, how as a Republican are you going to get in? I mean, I think that actually stacks against, people who do have a different point of view.
So what we need is real competition on ideas, not just competition on labels. So you're correct that in
But
certain...
I'm just
Yeah,
using,
yeah, please.
take away the party labels, just saying someone who has a different point of view. It's hard, if they're not liberal, they won't get in the top 5.
So I actually suspect that that's not the case, meaning even now, California actually moved to an early version, top 2, and a Republican often gets in, and there's only 2, meaning the liberal votes in California didn't just select 2 liberals. Almost always you still even have a Republican. So with 5, you would absolutely have people across the spectrum. Will there be from time to time a district that puts 5 liberals forward? Absolutely, but if that's the competition that the voters in that district wanted, then that's the competition the voters should get, and 5 will be more diverse views and ideas and across the ideological spectrum, and bring innovation into the system because you have new people, putting forward additional ideas. There's not just room for two. So I don't see at all that you will regularly disenfranchise an entire sort of wave on the spectrum. I think we'll see entirely different sorts of results from a top 5 primary. And even if they're all liberals, we'll have competition between them, which is what we need.
Well, as I said, I think anything that reduces the terror of the primary is a great thing. My concerns have to do with the nature of our changed political culture, where though Americans complain about Congress, Americans are against some of the things that made Congress work in the past. For example, Americans, for some reason, are against earmarks. Now, I think John McCain was a hero and a great legislator, but I think that the earmarks reform was a terrible idea. How are you going to get someone who disagrees with you to want to vote to help you with your one bill unless you can give them something in return? And earmarks were the bridge or the thing that you could give, and you could take that back to your district. And when people in your district said, how come you voted yes on whatever it was? You could say, well, you do what you do, but look what I did. The new VA hospital, the new this, the new that. We've taken away some of the lubricant that made it possible for deal-making in Congress. We've also, at least one party, but I suspect both, have made, maybe you and I actually agree, Michael, about, I don't call it ideology, I call it purity. Because, by the way, if it changes every 5 weeks, it's not ideology. If you can take someone who was a protectionist last week and make them a free trader, and then next week make them a protectionist again, I don't think ideology matters. What matters is the script, all right? The sacred script from the leadership telling you how to be pure. And one of the things that's gone wrong, I think, I'm on a soapbox, I guess, but I'm not standing, is that in the 1990s, we went to a referendum idea for government. I'm actually not a great fan of the progressive, I like the progressive reforms in the Theodore Roosevelt's period, but some of the progressive reforms that basically said, I don't want you to think for me. I'm going to tell you exactly what I want you to do when I vote for you. So every cockamamie idea I might have as somebody who's never actually had to worry about the federal budget is going to dictate the way you vote when you get to Washington and you finally realize how complicated the federal budget is. Sometime in the 90s, this became a very powerful form of political culture, and it was the contract with America. I call it a contract on America.
Yeah, no.
Because what it did was it said to people, I know better than you, I'm electing you, and if you don't follow every cockamamie idea I have, I'm going to vote you out. Even though we want people when they get to Washington to learn, because most people are too busy dealing with their families, running their small business, or running whatever it is that they did back in Iowa, probably a corn business, to know about the federal government. So when they get to Washington, you want them to learn. But we have a political culture that doesn't want them to learn, that just wants them to do exactly what they thought was right when they were living back in Iowa, and that's not very healthy.
Michael, you wanted to say something, then I want to ask one last question.
Yeah, again, I'm having a bit of a disconnect. We've gutted the staffs of all committees. There's nobody to help the legislators think. We have no more compromise committees between the Republican bill and the Senate bill. It's all partisan, and it's all driven by lobbying and special interest pleading. And, earmarks, I guess earmarks, you can make the case that earmarks were a way of bringing people together, but is that the way we want our government to work? We'd like to have people in office that are, problem-solving people that are going to work collaboratively, which we have had periods in time where that worked very well, to get it right and not need to get bribed for something in their district in order to do it. So I get the earmark point. We understand that, and we've written about that. But again, we're trying to think here about what would be a political process that would actually help us solve problems and get it right, and do compromise when it's good and don't compromise when it's bad. And I work on policy. I've worked in many, many areas, and there's no policy that is not complicated. You've got to make sausage. You've got to worry about different points of view of different people and put that together, but we don't have a mechanism for that now. We have the party leaders are just, riding herd in a very simplistic way over everything that happens.
And I think we're all for something that can help make the system work better.
Yeah.
So one last question is, you're focusing on the local, I mean, not just the local, but state level too, but will this have an impact on eradicating corruption, at the state level? I mean, we know that there's so much corruption. We've seen what's happened here in New York. I don't know what's happened in Wisconsin, but will this have any impact on eradicating corruption or eroding corruption?
Any reform, any change to the rules that gives more accountability and more power and voice to the voters and gives more choice is an opportunity to hold people accountable for results and for not being corrupt. So right now, there's simply no way to turn out there's not no way. It's very difficult to get rid of corruption because there's no other choices that we can have. And if I could, Cheryl, say something, I actually think there's broad agreement here in the sense that you said you agree with top 5 primaries and ranked choice voting as being theoretical good constructs. The debate that we may be having is that enough? And is that the only thing we should do? And also, the things were never perfect. And that the culture is a key factor here. So again, what I want to say to everybody assembled here is, we agree, for example, that the culture is really determinative of what's possible in the country. But if you look at our rubric of to recommend something, we need it to be powerful and achievable, there is not a lever to pull, one lever, that we could pull as citizens to say, change the culture, let's all agree on something. There's not a lever to pull to change the media because we think it would be powerful to change the media in some way if we all now agreed on the same set of facts and we all agreed on the same people that we believed in telling us the truth. There's no lever to pull on that. What we want to do is pull the levers where we do have control, and we have that control over the rules of the game for how we vote. And that's the foundation of the democracy. It's the first thing we need to do. Once you do that, what's really amazing is what's in the sweet spot of powerful and achievable changes over time, because now, as I said, Cheryl, in response to your earlier question, once you have more competition, it's powerful to have more voters participate. Right now, it's not fundamentally that powerful because there's still only the 2 unsatisfactory choices. So this is the direction we need to go. It's iterative, it's imperfect, it's not utopia, it's nonetheless, our democracy. It's the best there is.
Well,
we can change it.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. We actually have time for questions from the public. So I will let Herb come up and take questions from the public.
About everything you were super helpful. I love
Thank
everything
you.
you said. I did.
Now that our panelists have wrapped everything up in a nice bow, we have time for a few questions. Before we take the questions, I want people to line up at 2 microphones, and we'll take the questions, as many as we have time for. I would like to first introduce Gehl Brewer. Gehl is our, why don't you come up here? Gehl Brewer is our Manhattan Borough President, and she's going to make a few quick comments about ranked choice voting in New York.
Thank you very much. I am Gehl Brewer, Manhattan Borough President. I'm here with Jim Karras, who was our member on the wonderful commission, Charter 2019. So those of you who live in New York City, on November 5th, you are going to be voting on this topic that you've heard such an eloquent discussion of today. In fact, you can even vote starting October 26th all the way till November 3rd, early voting. If anybody, how many people live in New York City? So you're all going to be voting. You have to figure out which one of those locations if you want to vote early. So the first question, there are 5. We're going to talk about just one. And the issue there is ranked choice voting will be in New York City if, in fact, you vote for it. It will be available only for primary and special elections. We can vote up to 5 people, so we'll be voting November 5th. And then, if yes, it would go into effect next year, January 2020. But it would only be relevant until 21, because that's when the city elections are. And there will be a primary in June 2021, and that's the first time that we would use it if, in fact, it takes place. So very quickly, I would say examples are, it will be shown, you will vote 5 if the one at the bottom doesn't do very well, because if you don't get 50% plus 1, then you are not going to be the candidate, and the one at the bottom, those votes are redistributed. It just happened in Maine, where last year there were a Republican candidate, Democrat candidate, and some independents, and the short version is the Republican did not get 50% plus 1. Some of the independents were at the bottom. Their votes were redistributed, and the Democrat, by a few 800 votes, won the election. So there is a choice that is fun to participate in. We think there would be more women, more people of color, and we also think that it decreases negative campaigning. When the mayor ran, de Blasio, some people like him, some people don't, that's not the issue, but the issue was he only went to 10 districts to really win, and he only won with 35% of the vote, which is not all of us. So I think it's really, really an excellent choice. Very quickly, Jim Karras, who is an attorney and knows more about this than I do. Jim Karras, very quickly.
So, thank you. This was really interesting. Please vote on November 5th or an early election before for ranked choice voting. I'm speaking here on my own behalf. I'm a member of the 2019 Commission. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Commission. One of the things we looked at, we had concerns, were to make sure that this didn't have any negative effects on women and people of color. We looked at the study in the Bay City area that showed that more women and people of color as candidates succeeded under ranked choice voting. We also uncovered in our research that the Department of Justice has used ranked choice voting as a remedy where they have found election problems. So we were comfortable that it not only, like Gehl said, decreases negative campaigning, increases candidates' likelihood to look to a broader array of voters and make their appeals to a broader array of voters, but also will help women and people of color. So please vote on November 5th.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Okay, let's begin with first question. A microphone here. State your name.
Hi. Brilliant presentation and discussion, folks, and hugely inspiring for someone in his late 40s who can get cynical from time to time. I have a question about the extent, I realize that you said, number one, you're not sort of claiming to be political scientists, and number two, that the topic that everyone cares the most about in this room is the American political system. I just wonder whether you have had any opportunity to study whether any of these innovations or similar innovations have been implemented in other countries and what the effects there have been. Has there been any research or any study on that thus far?
Do you want to? Okay. So we don't do comparative politics. We're super results focused. And I think that is a fascinating topic, what's happening in other countries. We have people often from other countries, and what we tell them is, we don't know what's going on in your country, but we know you'll have rules of the game in your political system. You'll have some kind of political industrial complex. Power and value created in that industry will be distributed in a helpful way to the public interest or a less helpful way, so they can use these tools to understand it. Having said that, there isn't a system that we've seen out there that says, let's go run our democracy like that because it will deliver better results. I think there's so much difference between countries, their cultures, all the other factors, their constitutions, that I don't tend to think that would be enormously helpful. We have to use our theoretical knowledge and the data that we have about what's happening in the United States to determine what direction we should go.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Alice Underwood. I'm a board member of FairVote, fairvote.org, and I'd just like to offer to the question that came up earlier of how much benefit could we expect to see from these changes. And on the FairVote website, on fairvote.org, you can get references to various studies that have been done. You know, there was reference made to changes in the San Francisco Bay Area, the benefit that was seen in terms of increasing voter turnout, and there's actually a controlled experiment that kind of happened by chance and the way things worked out. So again, you can see how ranked choice voting does drive up participation in voter participation and in the diversity of candidates. There's also, although we don't have a study of top 5, there is some discussion of study of top 4 primaries and the benefits that have been derived from that. So I'd encourage anybody who's a data-driven person like myself, please check out the fairvote.org website.
Next question. Please ask questions and do not use your time to just make comments. Please ask questions.
Thank you so much for the discussion. Without having read your book, I was wondering how exactly you address the issue of gerrymandering, because from my perspective, when you think about actionable mechanisms of change, I believe that addressing the issue of gerrymandering is actually going to be more impactful, because essentially what you have now is politicians choosing their voters. And there are a number of paradigms. If I'm recalling correctly, California has a nonpartisan commission for redistricting. So that could be a more impactful mechanism of affecting change from my perspective.
That is a phenomenal question, because particularly because so many more people in the country know about and are concerned about gerrymandering. We used to have what we called an election trifecta, which is let's change how we vote with top 5 RCV, and we preceded that with nonpartisan gerrymandering. Here's why it's not our priority. Again, I refer you back to powerful and achievable because we're about getting things done. Gerrymandering has now become so politicized, which is to say that because the Republicans were more successful in the 2010 midterms, they controlled more state legislatures, and they were able to gerrymander more states than the Democrats were this time, although historically both parties are equally guilty. But what that means is that when you put gerrymandering reform into what you want to change, you immediately, it's like a poison pill. You make the whole package partisan. You make it a Democratic package, and that takes it right out of powerful and achievable, because it's not achievable anymore because we have to get this done on a bipartisan basis. But the other thing is that effectively, these 2 innovations, top 5 RCV, leapfrog the need for nonpartisan gerrymandering, and here's why. First of all, do you know how hard it's going to be to figure out how to write the algorithms to effectively figure out how many Democrats or Republicans you need to leave in a district in order to triumph against 4 other candidates in a ranked choice voting election? It will be much harder because it's not this binary choice. Second is because there is truth to the fact that certain districts are naturally so much more liberal or conservative than other districts. So we need good competition in those, fair and complete and robust dynamic competition in those districts as well. And even if you had nonpartisan gerrymandering, you'll still have districts that are largely liberal or conservative. So remember what I said, things that are in the intersection of powerful and achievable change over time. Let's focus on top 5 RCV. We will elect people who are not beholden to either side of the duopoly and are beholden to the public interest. If it turns out then that gerrymandering reform, is still a super big problem, then those are politicians who would be more free to change those rules at that time. So we're sequencing our reforms. someone once said, a famous business strategist right here, that strategy is about choosing what not to do. And that's what we've done in our work, is choose what not to do by saying, let's do this thing first, because it's the most powerful package we can find to be the first mover.
Next question.
Thanks. What would you say to James Madison, who wrote Federalist 10, which boiled down to him saying, okay, powerful, achievable, efficient, and reflective of the majority, no, we don't want any of those things. What we want is a government that's not a monarchy, like the one that we just left. We want to make sure that the federal government is so dysfunctional that minorities can never be oppressed, and that the branches of government all have co-equal requirement for problem solving. And we have a federalist system where states are on the hook for problem solving when we can't get something done by design in government, which is designed to go slow, because some people's lack of innovation is, you know, at least James Madison, the founder's stability. Stability. Thanks.
Okay, I'd say I agree with James Madison. I'm a huge federalist. I think the fact that we have 50 laboratories of democracy is phenomenal, and I also think that these innovations have great promise, but there's no danger that they're going to make tons of solutions come super, super quickly. It won't be that powerful.
We have time for 2 more questions, and then I would say that if you want to come up, perhaps the speakers will stick around, but we have to wrap up the formal section. I'll take 1 more here and 1 more here.
Sure, and I'll be very brief. I've been using your report for the last couple years in my outreach and organizing, and I can't tell you how many light bulbs have gone off when I have shamelessly stolen your line about the system is not broken, it's fixed. And one of the things I experienced that more people are aware of that and want to do something about that. I also was somewhat flabbergasted when Nancy Pelosi made her first bill upon becoming the majority leader, an election reform bill. So my question is this: as there is more and more traction on these issues of structural reform, changing the system, unrigging the system, what's the pushback look like from the duopoly? My experience is a little bit of, they're not just opposing it, they're finding ways to cherry pick aspects of it and derail it. But I'd like to know how you guys think about that.
Maybe you could answer that.
Okay, first of all, I want to say hello, John Updike, who's been in this industry of political innovation much longer than I have. Kudos to you for doing this work for so long. I appreciate it. So what is the pushback from the duopoly? So yes, there's absolutely pushback. The story of Maine, and you remember I told you they passed their ranked choice voting bill 2 years ago in June, and the pushback from both sides of the duopoly trying to thwart it at every turn and at multiple turns, meaning they kept coming back to the well to make ranked choice voting go away, proves that that's going to be a problem. Having said that, I think that we are really appealing directly to our message is tailored for business and professional communities to bring them on board, because we thought they were basically MIA from this conversation because they thought that politics was sort of not rational and not something they could understand. You know, those crazy people who do those crazy things, I'm going to focus on my rational business where I can actually make a difference. So getting business and professional communities on board with political innovation, with rules of the game, is, I think, a game changer. And over time, look, our political system is broken. There's no question, even though I said it's not, but in that vernacular it is. They still have to win. Okay, we still do have elections, and they still don't hold power if they're turned out. So if a critical mass of people decide that they're not going to re-elect people who refuse to pass these innovations, we can win. if and in 26 states, we can bypass entirely the elected state legislators to change these rules of the game by having citizens' initiatives and referendums, and then we just need a majority of citizens to go and vote these innovations in. It will not be super easy, but it's still totally doable, and no matter the pushback, it's sort of, I can't wait to see pushback. I can't wait to get so much traction that the biggest problem the duopoly has is figuring out how to protect themselves from this new, threat of innovation.
I think a lot of the legislators that I know would die to have this new system that worked. Their job stinks. It's a horrendous job. It's frustrating. They can't do what they know is right. They can't work with their colleagues. They can't study things. They're controlled by their party leaders. It's a miserable place to be right now. And so I think the pushback has been fairly muted. I mean, we don't have people, calling us and yelling. In fact, most of the political leaders we talk to are very sympathetic to, wow, wouldn't this be a better world? This is the way it used to be. We used to be collegial. We used to have dinner together. We used to have committees where the committee members were experts. Now our committees are no longer experts. They're carefully selected by the leaders to not be experts so that the leaders will drive what the committee does. So I think the pushback, at least that I've experienced, has been fairly modest so far. And I think the reason is that the insiders, this will be better for the ones that really are public servants and really want to do something good for the country. And the people that are going to lose here are the people that have built their whole careers on the special interest game and the partisanship and being in control and getting your story, as you were saying, sir, getting your story to come true, because that's what you believe, in your core is the only way to run our country and the way we ought to operate. So we saw in the progressive era that actually a bunch of the insiders joined the movement once it got started. So there's a big momentum factor here. If we can get ranked choice voting in 2 or 3 states,
Top 5.
And top 5 in 1 or 2 states, what we're going to see is a momentum effect that will start to grow. And the problem right now is too many people think that it's impossible to change this. And they just give up. I mean, they don't even think about it. We're confident that you can change this. We've done it before in America, but we got to get started. And these are the 2 most powerful, intuitively clear, we think, steps to take to start down the right road. So anyway, thanks for your comment and your work.
I'm not giving up, but I am turning into a pumpkin, and Tim may be also. I have to catch a plane back to the Midwest. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you guys can stay. Oh, I didn't mean to end it. Right. Okay, I gotta go though.
Thank you. Good points.
I'm Tim. Well,
Good
I just
points,
wanted to
yeah.
remind
Yeah,
you, the
yeah.
system, you were a bit romantic about the system.
Hey, Tim. Tim, thank you. Tim.
My pleasure, Ken.
Have a good night.
But it's not.
Around.
It's a different system.
A few decades, absolutely.